So, hello everyone, and a warm welcome to our lecture, Divine Science and the Tree of Life, an Introduction to Kabbalah. I would also like to welcome a speaker, Professor Yossi Chajes, who will enlighten us about the teachings and history of Kabbalah today. Whether you have been studying Kabbalah for some time, or this is your first encounter with it, this evening surely will give you fascinating insights into what has been the dominant expression of Jewish mysticism from the Middle Ages onwards. With its many diagrams, of which Professor Chajes will show some today, it tries to communicate how the divine is structured and how creation was made. Ever since I started as a researcher at the embassy, I've been hugely fascinated with this intellectual tradition. And it is, in a way, like an onion. The more you read about it and study it, the more layers you can uncover and the deeper you can go. I'm sure that during this wonderful lecture, Yossi will uncover many layers of Kabbalah with us and surely will leave you with the desire to learn even more. So, talking about learning more, I would like to mention Yossi Chajes' enormous work on the Ilanot diagrams that are essential to the expression on Kabbalistic thought. This wonderful book here. In 2022, he published his extensive research in a profoundly academic but yet very accessible way in this beautiful illustrated book called The Kabbalistic Tree. I've myself learned a lot from this book and really can recommend it to everybody who would like to dive deeper. And also today we have a very special offer for you, namely, if you're participating today, you can get it for 30% off. You can get the special link for that from the chat. The book is also one of the many results of the Ilanot project, a project founded by Professor Chajes dedicated to the understudied genre of sculpts featuring the diagram of the Tree of Life. Professor Yossi Chajes received his education at the University of Michigan and did his doctoral studies at Yale University. He has been a research fellow at countless universities, including the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the Jewish Theologian Seminary in New York, and the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Since 2013, he serves as the division chair for rabbinic literature, Jewish law, and Jewish thought at the executive board of the World Union for Jewish Studies. Currently, he holds the Sir Isaac Wolfson Chair of Jewish Thought at the University of Haifa. Professor Chajes is with no doubt one of the most profound scholars in Kabbalah, and we are very honored to welcome you tonight. Before we begin, I have one last remark. It is possible to submit your questions via the chat, and after the lecture, I will come back to as many of them as possible during the Q&A session. Professor Chajes, it is wonderful to have you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kira. I have to begin by expressing my appreciation for the easy way in which Dutch speakers can pronounce my family name. It's always nice to hear someone get it right without having to ask. My pleasure to be with you. And okay, I think I've got it sorted. I'm going to go right into my lecture now because we have a lot of onions to peel as I gather. And I'll say at the outset, although I think I can pull this off, I can say something while sharing. This is, on the one hand, a quick introduction to Kabbalah, but it's not a typical introduction to Kabbalah, and it's not an off the rack introduction to Kabbalah, but a custom-made introduction to Kabbalah. And it's custom-made because I have based it almost exclusively on images that were so graciously supplied to me by my friends at the Embassy of the Free Mind. And I should also say that it's been probably 15 years or so since I began working with the Ritman Library and the Embassy of the Free Mind, and the librarians there have been fantastic friends and colleagues and allies, and helped me obtain some very important images in the book that you so generously shared with those participating this evening. So there are just a couple of images in this presentation that aren't in the collection, but I think it makes it very special to know that pretty much everything that you're seeing this evening, images that I'm using to help tell the story of Kabbalah in less than an hour, are right there in Amsterdam in your wonderful collection. So I'll just get started. So the first point that I'd like to make is that Kabbalah is not a synonym for Jewish mysticism, and in fact, I tend to avoid the term mysticism in favor of a terminology even in languages other than Hebrew that at least has a terminology that has some connection to the usages that we find in Jewish tradition. But Kabbalah is a development in a much longer history of Jewish esotericism. And it is a development that took place over the course of the 12th century and really consolidating as a distinctive and systematic form of thought only around the year 1300. So when people use the term Kabbalah carefully, they are not using it to refer just generically to any Jewish tradition that touches upon areas of secrecy or discretion, but specifically with regard to a broad school of esotericism that developed, as I've said, in the 12th and early 13th centuries, and has been with us ever since. Some might say that by the time you get to modernity, it's perhaps best to use a different term yet again, even though, for example, the Hasidic movement as a spiritual, intellectual tradition is deeply indebted to Kabbalah, and many of the great teachers of Hasidism were great Kabbalists. Some would say Hasidism deserves to be kind of given its own label. It's not Kabbalah anymore, and now it's Hasidism. Even in Israel, when we have within our Jewish thought departments at the universities, people say we do Kabbalah and Hasidism. It's never presumed or subsumed under the category of Kabbalah. The only thing that I have time to say, I think, in the current context, is that before the Middle Ages, there was plenty of Jewish esotericism. It just did not have the hallmark features associated with the Kabbalistic tradition. And if we go all the way back to the origins of Judaism, and by that I mean the rabbinic tradition, the primary foci of rabbinic esotericism were the first chapter of Genesis and the first chapter of Ezekiel. So those two, and in fact, Genesis, it's a little more than the first chapter, but the beginning of Genesis, and let's just keep it the beginning of Ezekiel, those are the hubs of Jewish esoteric speculation. That speculation may have had experiential aspects, but as the rabbis discuss it in classical rabbinic literature, it's primarily esoteric exegesis, esoteric understanding of that biblical material, with the focus on the beginning of Genesis being cosmogonic secrets, secrets pertaining to the creation of the cosmos, and the focus in the speculation around Ezekiel's chariot. That's what's described in the first chapter of Ezekiel, being what we would call, using Greek terminology, cosmology. So cosmogony and cosmology, beginning of Genesis, beginning of Ezekiel. And there's, of course, much more to say about that pre-Kabbalistic Jewish esotericism, but again, well, I'm going to try and keep things moving. You're seeing in the image from a Kabbalistic manuscript what is probably the oldest and most persistent Jewish symbol, the menorah, the candelabrum of 7 branches that stood in the tabernacle and then the first and second temples, here associated with characteristic features of the Kabbalah, the characteristic idea of the Kabbalah, which I'll speak about in just a moment, namely the Sfirot. And as I've just said, without reference to a text on your screen, indeed, the most distinctive feature of Kabbalistic thought is the notion of Sfirot. And using the term Sfirot, not translating it into another term in another language, because it is a technical term, and it also because the meaning of that technical term actually changed in the course of the history of Jewish esotericism, as I'll soon explain. The term appears for the first time in a mysterious work, still the subject of much scholarly debate to our day, a work by the name of Sefer Yetzirah, which has been translated, I think, a lot of different ways, but probably most frequently as the book of creation or the book of formation. And I'm maybe getting ahead of myself a little bit here saying this, but I mean, I'm sure that the Embassy of the Free Mind has 100 translations of Sefer Yetzirah in its collection. I mean, it would be interesting to see how far off I am with that guess, but it's a book that had a tremendous amount of influence, and really an outsized influence in many ways. And as you might expect now, having heard that they have maybe 100 editions or translations in the library, its influence is felt well beyond the confines of the Jewish tradition. One of the two, let's say the two big debates about Sefer Yetzirah are where was it written and when was it written? And till this day, there is no consensus among scholars with regard to either of those questions. I recently made a discovery that has been carried forward by a young scholar named Judith Weiss. And I won't go into that now, but on the basis of some of the work that I did a couple of years ago, the 7th century is emerging as ever more probable, but it really doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is that the term Sfirot appears there for the first time in the history of Hebrew literature. What's fascinating to observe is that, and especially if you've come from the study of Kabbalah, is that the term, although used for the first time in Sefer Yetzirah, doesn't mean what it would mean in the history of Kabbalah come the 13th century and on. In fact, in Sefer Yetzirah, if you just read it straight without projecting anachronistic cosmological ideas onto its pages, Sfirot means basically counted things. The Hebrew root samech pei resh can mean many things, but it can mean number, it can mean book. It also seems to at least somehow engage the Greek sphere. But in Sefer Yetzirah, I think the simplest way of describing what it means is the 10 things that count, the 10 counted things. And those are the 10 things that are fundamental to reality as everyone experiences it. And those 3 things are space, time, and value. 3-dimensional space, the 4 cardinal directions, up and down, that's 6 right there. Time is called in Sefer Yetzirah Omek Reshit and Omek Acharit, which means you might say the vector of the beginning and the vector of the end. So that basically some timeline of past to future. And the third one is Omek Tov and Omek Ra in Hebrew, which means the depth of good and the depth of bad. Good and bad don't exist in space or time. They are the values of humans, and therefore the human is part of what makes the world what it is. We are the ones who bring meaning in this cosmological system of Sefer Yetzirah. So again, the 10 sfirot are space, time, and value. And Sefer Yetzirah has a very powerful poetic style, and one of the things that it almost chants as an incantatory prose is there are 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. These are the 10, the 10 sfirot, 10 sfirot of nothingness, 10 sfirot of them. So this text had an enormous influence, as I've said, and over some generations, the term sphira was transvalued. I think that may be the best term to use. Its meaning evolved or changed. It's not exactly clear yet how this happened. One of my colleagues has lately been working on the commentary on Sefer Yetzirah written by Judah Levi, and his Kuzari, and regarding that commentary as an important transitional moment in the transformation of Sefer Yetzirah into a Kabbalistic, it didn't become a Kabbalistic book, but it became a book viewed by the Kabbalists as their foundational text. But again, we only have an hour, so I'm just going to keep it moving. So again, Sefer Yetzirah is not a Kabbalistic text, but it's a little bit like if you read rabbinic literature and see how often they cite the Bible as the authority. And they cite the Bible as the authority, even though the Bible isn't a rabbinic text. It's maybe because it's not a rabbinic text, they refer to it as the authority. They're also, I think it's fair to say, not overly concerned with trying to critically ascertain what the Bible really meant, because they know what they want. And so they're able to use the biblical text to their purposes, with a lot of what we would call chutzpah. But so too, the Kabbalists use Sefer Yetzirah without really trying to figure out what Sefer Yetzirah was saying in its time and place. They're not trying to reconstruct its original meaning. They are inspired by it, and they'll say, so there are 10 sfirot, like it says in Sefer Yetzirah. A lot of things, like it says in Sefer Yetzirah. I think I'm spending a little extra time on Sefer Yetzirah because this is a lecture for the Embassy of the Free Mind, and it is a work that had such a tremendous influence, not just on Jewish Kabbalah, but on Western esotericism, on Western philosophy more generally. Another friend and colleague of mine at Yale has been working on the influence of Kabbalah more generally, even on German idealist philosophy, and things go to places that we can hardly believe sometimes. Certainly, the entire long tradition of the combinatory arts was very much influenced by Sefer Yetzirah. And again, just a reminder, the images you're seeing are from books in the Embassy of the Free Mind, this being their copy of Sefer Yetzirah, one of their copies of Sefer Yetzirah. This image, I must say, is not in your library, but I just thought it might be handy. It's a relatively simple Kabbalistic tree in the generic sense, by which I mean it's not just a diagram, but it's a much larger parchment that has the Kabbalistic tree inscribed upon it, but is large enough to accommodate a good deal of text that provides the student with all of the relevant names and appellations for the 10 Sfirot, as well as information pertinent to the networking system that connects those 10 Sfirot. But I haven't yet explained anything about what the 10 Sfirot meant in the Kabbalistic tradition, and that's what this slide is for. So as I wrote, in Kabbalistic thought, Sfirot become hypostatic aspects or qualities or categories of the divine. I borrow the term hypostatic primarily from Christian theology for this purpose, although it has more ancient roots. But it's basically it's a term that was used by Christian theologians to deal with the problem of the Trinity, how three can be one in the Godhead. Abraham Abulafia, who was a famous prophetic Kabbalist in the 13th century, who was the exception in the Kabbalistic tradition insofar as he had a certain reticence, a reluctance to go too far with the notion of the Sfirot, and he was more into the combinatory art side of things, less into the Sphirotic system. He said, well, the Christians have 3, and that's bad enough, but the Kabbalists have 10. That's really a problem. But from that, we can infer that the hypostatic is not a bad term to use to describe the Sfirot. I think it's also really interesting and important to emphasize that Kabbalah is a post-philosophical school of Jewish esotericism. It's a form of esotericism that emerges after Maimonides. It's not part of the ancient rabbinic tradition, and it doesn't act like it. It doesn't play like it. It doesn't talk like it. It's for the most part, and I'll speak soon about an important exception to this rule. For the most part, it's very systematic and very organized and very logical, and it shows tremendous influence of Jewish philosophy, of medieval religious philosophy, and of Maimonides in particular. The Kabbalists all read Maimonides, and they have Maimonides looking over their shoulders when they talk about the Sfirot. And if any of you know anything about Maimonides, this is news to you, you're thinking, how is that possible? How could a Kabbalist possibly pay homage to Maimonides, who would have thought everything they were doing was idolatrous? But this is just, I think Harold Bloom said the history of the history of literature is the history of misreading. So the Kabbalists didn't have any real problem misreading Maimonides or misconstruing Maimonides. But there is one thing that I think that they they got right, which was when you push a Kabbalist into a corner and say, okay, I get the Sfirot, I understand there are 10 categories, there are all these different qualities of the divine and so forth. But really, tell me, like, who is really God? I want to know the truth. What is God? Who is God? They'll say, okay, well, like Maimonides said, God is no thing. In other words, it's the atiphatic theology. You can't say what God is, you can only say what God isn't. And the Kabbalists internalized and embraced the Maimonidean notion of the apophatic God and gave it a name that Maimonides didn't use. That name is Ein Sof, no end. Sometimes they just call God Ein, which is the ultimate kind of Eckhardtian nothing with a capital N name for God. And you can see it on this chart, on this Ilan, Kabbalistic tree, above the tree of the 10 Sfirot. And in fact, the typical iconography shows the lower half of the medallion signifying Ein Sof as blackened, as if to suggest that it's unknowable. Your mind may ascend the attributes of the tree, and you may have some understanding of especially the lower attributes, and maybe you can even get some inkling of wisdom and understanding, and crown is already above those. But the Ein Sof, that no end, you're not going to get. It's beyond human comprehension, and therefore, I think it's fair to say Kabbalists had relatively little to say about it. So most of Kabbalistic thought is focused on the 10 Sfirot that you see under Ein Sof. So if Ein Sof is that God about which nothing can be said, the Sfirot are the God about which much can be said. In fact, an early Kabbalistic pun from 14th century Italy says that Sphira comes from lesaper, to tell a story, because all the stories of all of reality forever and are stories of the Sfirot being revealed in countless ways. So Sfirot are stories. And the way they combine and recombine, and what happens to the divine light as it passes through this network, going through different spherotic hubs to create different combinations of energies. That's what gives rise to the entire variety of reality as we know it. One of the questions that Kabbalists had to answer was, if these Sfirot contain opposite qualities, or they represent opposite qualities, how is it that they can even communicate? Because as we know in the kind of pre-modern scientific terms, occult channels of communication open up through resemblance. When there is some similarity between two things, a channel which is invisible to the eye, making it occult. The occult channel opens that connects those two things, which are otherwise unrelated. So the Kabbalistic answer to the problem of how to love and judgment communicate, if love in their terms, in its purest sense, is giving without accounts, without any giving without any qualifications. And judgment is just the opposite of that, really. Sometimes the more emotive term, fear, is used, or judgment. How do they communicate? Well, the answer was that all 10 sfirot are fractal insofar as each contain all, so that within chesed, within love, is also judgment, and within judgment is also love. And it's the fact that in each an aspect of the other can be found that opens up the channels that that create the spherotic network. I think it's also fascinating that Kabbalists thought that it was worth making this idea physical, and that they did so by creating diagrams of the spherotic tree that included volvels, which are spinning wheels used frequently in medieval calendrical and mathematical treatises. And so when you open this work, which you have in Amsterdam, you can maybe set up an appointment and go have a look at it, and then you can spin the wheels around. And maybe when you spin the wheels around, you'll get it in a way that might not have happened without that haptic interface. It's not just an image, it's a moving image. It also, I think, is connecting to what would have been the medieval user's familiarity with calculation devices that would be in calendrical and astronomical and mathematical manuscripts. The work that you've just seen in manuscript with the volvels was also printed. The printers typically did not bother to manually attach volvels, but they did create engravings that give you this exact image that we saw on the manuscript page a moment ago. And this edition of the very same work is in the Amsterdam collection as well, of the Embassy of the Free Mind, in its 1623 printed edition, printed in Mantova. The book is called Assis Rimonim, and it's an abridgment of sorts of the Kabbalistic classic of mid-16th century Safed called the Pardes Rimonim, an orchard of pomegranates, which is the great Summa of classical Kabbalah written by Moses Cordovero. Okay. So, and now a little word from, from Yossi, the Kabbalistic tree guy. You wouldn't necessarily have to do this if someone else was giving the lecture, but how could I not point out that the sphirot were often visualized and graphically realized with an arboreal diagram, which was a diagrammatic schema that got very popular in the 12th century, which was often called well, we know about the 12th century Renaissance, but there was a kind of diagrammatic aspect to the 12th century Renaissance that's getting increasingly more scholarly attention. And awareness of the diagrams in philosophical, scholastic, scientific treatises and religious works of various kinds has been growing since the 1980s. In any case, the arboreal diagram is a very big deal in the 12th century, and you see it primarily in natural philosophical works where the tree of Porphyry is the star, famously associated with Porphyry's commentary on Aristotle's categories. But it's also very famously in use to represent genealogical relations, whether in the churches that have trees of Jesse to show the genealogy of Jesus, or in the famous rhodoli of Peter of Poitiers that show the genealogies of the Carolingians and whatever, church history and biblical history are also illustrated with arboreal family trees. And one of the things that I like to suggest about the leveraging or the appropriation of the Kabbalistic, of the tree of porphyry, let's say, by the Kabbalists, is that it was actually just a brilliant idea, theologically speaking, to embrace it, because the tree was in widespread use. Everybody knew what it meant, just like we know now how to read a Venn diagram. In the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries, everyone knew exactly how to read a tree diagram. And I think most people today also understand, at least in the context of family trees, how to make sense of what's being expressed through this idiom. But they express relationships between ideas or objects without implying space. So just because my parents are on top of me on the family tree doesn't mean they're on top of me in space. So top and bottom don't mean top and bottom. They might mean, they might suggest simply a causal relationship that has no spatial aspect whatsoever. So I think, especially in a tradition like the Jewish tradition that has a second commandment, and that would, let's just say, raise some eyebrows to, well, how do you like my picture of God, this tree of Sfirot? What do you think of that picture of God? Say, what do you mean a picture of God? You don't, that's the 10 Commandments. Number 2 says, don't do that. So a Kabbalist can say, of course, it's not a picture of God. This is a visualization of hypostatic qualities within the Godhead, but it has nothing to do. You could, perhaps we could talk about sequence, a kind of causal sequence, but certainly not above, below, to the right, or to the left. And an iconic image of the Kabbalistic tree appears in this wonderful copy of a Latin translation of one of the first classic Kabbalistic texts by Joseph Gicatilla, Porte Lucas, printed in Augsburg in 1516, making it the first Kabbalistic book ever printed, albeit in Latin, but still a Jewish Kabbalistic book translated into Latin by a Jew who had converted to Christianity, and printed I think, just over 40 years before that classic text would be published in Hebrew for the first time. So on the frontispiece of Porte Lucis, Gates of Light, Sha'arei Orah is the Hebrew name, is what appears to be an old Kabbalist. There's some debate whether it was meant to represent the translator or perhaps Nachmanides, but he's literally holding the Kabbalistic tree in his hand. And this is also, perhaps you have something like it in the Embassy of the Free Mind, but this comes from a manuscript that's in Darmstadt that shows Lady Dialectic with the Porphyrian tree also being held in her hand, just to kind of give you a sense of the way these diagrammatic schema mirror one another so vividly. And here, in fact, is also now back again to the Embassy of the Free Mind collection, the first Mantovan printing of the Gates of Light in Hebrew from roughly 40 years. This was in 1561, if I read the date correctly there. So, okay. The Sfirot were often visualized with other diagrammatic schemata, concentric circles. I actually have onion skins here. It's now the third time I think onions have come up this evening. But what I'd simply like to say about this model of the Sfirot is that on the one hand, it's it was popular, and the image that you're seeing above on the top of the slide is among the very oldest Kabbalistic diagrammatic images. It appears already in the earliest Kabbalistic manuscripts that have reached us, that date back to the 1280s, and which were copied in Italy based on Spanish manuscripts that came at that time. You have here what may not be obvious at first glance. You have a kind of concentric circle diagram that's it's a bit square, but nevertheless it's meant to echo the idea of the nested layers of the onion, which isn't actually originally an astronomical metaphor for the concentric spheres of the planets and are basically our astronomical system. For the Kabbalistic version, they've taken the first letter of each of the 10 sfirot and sort of finessed it so as to be suggestive at the same time of one of those orbs. So the outermost one is the Kaf of Keter, or crown, and inside it is the Chet of Chokhmah, wisdom, and so forth, all the way to the Mem of Malchut, or kingdom, that's at the very center. So, so this is a very popular model. I think its main selling point is that it communicates structural continuity with the way the universe was conceived, at least until, I suppose it's fair to say, until Kepler's time or something, when the circles were abandoned for ellipses. But that's also its weak side from a Jewish theological point of view. It would be better to not visualize God in a manner that's so suggestive of space. Once again, I'm sort of contrasting these two possibilities of visualization against one another. Sometimes you find in Kabbalah symbolic approaches to the visualization of the Sfirot as well. These can be quite interesting, and this is taken also from, everything you're seeing is from the embassy. This is from a manuscript of Moses Cordevero's orchard of pomegranates. And it's in a section devoted to the visualization of the Sfirot, in which he says that one way this has been done is in the form of the first Hebrew letter, the Aleph. And there very directly, Cordovero says, of course, we don't think that the Sfirot look like an Aleph, but we want to say something about the Sfirot by visualizing them as an Aleph, because an Aleph is one. The Hebrew letters are like the Roman alphabet in terms of, right, this is all from, well, Cordovero is not from before Arabic numerals, but there's this ancient tradition of the letters as numbers, and Aleph is one. So we want all 10 to be one. So by forming an image of the Sfirot as an Aleph, we're also saying, although there are 10, the 10 are one. The secrets of scripture, of Jewish law and customs, and really of everything, then became expressed in the Kabbalistic tradition in Sphirotic terms. Once you have this way of reading everything through the lens of the 10 Sfirot, so things look a bit different. So the Hebrew Bible becomes not just a collection of stories about the God of Israel, the people of Israel, but a revealed text in which the inner workings of the divine have been encoded. When you read a story in the Bible, spherotically, it is revealed as a guide to the inner workings of the Godhead itself. And Jewish practices are mapped to the spherotic system and understood as techniques to achieve cosmic maintenance, including the maintenance of the divine itself, because there's a kind of central drama in Kabbalistic thought, which is that the divine is in need of human assistance to achieve its own harmonization and restoration. So I wrote here, in the Kabbalistic version of the great chain of being, every commandment was an opportunity to yank the chain, to yank the great chain of being. So again, another indication of the chutzpah of the rabbinic tradition generally, and of Kabbalah in particular. But this is really a critical point for the. Kabbalists understand the normative Jewish tradition through the lens of the Sfirot, making the normative tradition into a kind of mystery rite. Another thing that I think is important to stress, especially in this context, speaking to, I suppose, people who have many of them, I suppose, an interest in Western esotericism and in Christian mysticism. The discourse of Kabbalah is objectifying. Kabbalists talk about the divine with scientific rigor. And in fact, in the Middle Ages and through the early modern period, I'll touch upon this at the very end, which is coming soon. But Kabbalists were regarded even by non-Jewish scientists as thinkers who applied a kind of scientific methodology to the study of the divine. And we're not used to that. Many people are not used to that. If they're looking for mysticism and they think that Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism, they may feel disappointed because we don't have so many works of Kabbalistic literature in which Kabbalists describe their subjective experiences, their mystical states. Everything is presented much more objectively, both the divine realm itself and all of the things that one needs to do in order to influence the divine realm and thereby also improve the human realm. But here's the big exception that I said was coming, and it's a really big exception because the Zohar is, I think there's a consensus that the Zohar is the most significant work of Kabbalah ever composed. The only thing is, it's nothing like any other Kabbalistic work. So it's both the most important and exceptional in the Kabbalistic library. And on this slide, I also make the point that it was printed in the 16th century as the book Zohar, and is often thought of as a book, but it really isn't a book. It's a genre. It's a literature. It has conventions, and in fact, people composed Zoharic literature intensively over a few generations in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. And then in the 16th century, again, we find Kabbalists composing Zoharic style literature, and in the 18th century again. So really, anytime someone wants to compose a Zoharic work, they can try. But the Zohar is different from other Kabbalistic texts, primarily because it doesn't seem to be interested in informing its readers of these objective truths about these are the 10 Sfirot, and this is what you need to know. It's not a guidebook. It's much more like midrashic literature, which if you don't know, then You should Google it, but this is a classical rabbinic exegesis that's very playful, very creative, very poetic, very funny, very freaky, very free. And this is the way the Zohar proceeds. I like to tell my students that the Zohar is to Kabbalistic literature what like Michael Jordan is to basketball. Like just when, it's not that Michael Jordan is a teacher for little kids how to play basketball. This is how you dribble. Michael Jordan is, after you learn everything there is to know about basketball, how much of a virtuoso can you be to do anything on the court and it's still considered basketball? You can fly through the air and put the ball through the hoop, and we didn't even know you could do that. But yeah, you don't get a penalty. It's actually possible to do it. Or you could say it's like Beethoven using the sonata form. Why did we not remember the other 999 composers in Vienna who were writing sonatas in 1800? And we remember Beethoven, not because he wrote so well in the sonata form, but because of his virtuosity, his genius. So the Zohar has internalized all of the Kabbalistic facts, as it were, and is playing with them with virtuosity and freedom, and playfulness and depths, of course, surprises and subversive messages. And it makes it the most beloved text of Kabbalah ever written. And what you have in Amsterdam is a very rare Cremona first edition. The Zohar was printed in the same year, I think 1552, maybe, both in Mantua and in Cremona. In Mantua in 3 volumes, in Cremona in 1 large volume. And Cremona, a lot of people, usually people are very proud to have a copy of the Cremona edition. So I hope that you appreciate it there in Amsterdam and are studying Zohar, getting people together Thursday night to come to the library and study Zohar. So that's what I have to say about the Zohar. Very, very quick history lesson. The Zohar is composed, the Zoharic literature that's printed in Mantua and Cremona, it was written in the late 13th, early 14th century Spain. As you know, Jewish life in Spain came to an end in 1492 with the expulsion, the edict issued by Ferdinand and Isabella. And this was the greatest Jewish community in the world at that time. Also, numerically speaking, at least they estimated around 300,000 Jews were living in the Iberian Peninsula at that time. About a third of them converted to Christianity. About a third of them fled the Iberian Peninsula, and about a third of them crossed the border into Portugal, where they were all forcibly converted 5 years later in 1497. And Kabbalah moves around at this point. There are kind of, I would say, the 13th and 14th centuries, 15th centuries of Kabbalah. There's a lot of action in Italy. But the next big story in Kabbalah, it happens in Ottoman, in Ottoman times, in the Galilean town of Safed or Tzfat, in the wake of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire through its colonialist march of conquest that saw the capture of the Israel and Egypt in 1516. So 1516, the Ottomans take the land of Israel and have a much more welcoming policy to Jews than the previous Islamic lords of the land. And a significant number of Jews from the diaspora return to living in the land of Israel. There were 4 highly populated cities with a Jewish population in the 16th century. They were Jerusalem, Hebron, Gaza, and Safed. Ottomans didn't actually administer this region locally. So the Galilee, the northern part of the land, was administered out of Constantinople, and Jerusalem was administered in Damascus, and Gaza was administered in Cairo. And the taxation policies were different in each location, and Safed had the best terms. It also was the most financially feasible place to move to. And it was also the closest to Mount Meron, a mountain just facing Safed, where by the 16th century tradition had claimed was the burial place of Shimon Bar Yochai, who's the hero of the Zohar. So with the Zohar's canonization, the appeal of living near the burial place of Shimon Bar Yochai grew. And Safed became a town that hosted a real renaissance of Jewish life in the 16th century, especially from the middle of the 16th century going forward a number of decades. In Kabbalistic terms, you have the two main figures that are pivotal figures in the history of Kabbalah. One has been mentioned already, Moses Cordovero, and the second is Isaac Luria, who lived there for barely 2 years before dying, but taught with such inspiration and such depth that his disciples devoted the rest of their lives to trying to create a system out of the teachings they heard from him over the 2 years that he was teaching. Just maybe, I should just say, okay, if I had to contrast the Zohar and Lurianic Kabbalah, I would say that Zohar is Eros and Lurianic Kabbalah is anatomy. Now, if I put this together with what I wanted to say a moment ago, if you ask Isaac Luria to say something about Lurianic Kabbalah, it would be like asking Jesus to say something about Christianity. He would look at you and say, well, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as Lurianic Kabbalah. And you say to him, what are you doing? What did you teach? He said, well, I was just teaching Zohar. I was reading Zohar and explaining it. But the gaze of Lurianic Kabbalah on the divine is very different than the gaze of the Zohar upon the divine. The gaze of the Zohar upon the divine is beautiful. It is eros, it's love, and it's full of desire, and it's very tangible. And the gaze of Lurianic Kabbalah is quite clinical. So, if the Zohar says that the Shekhinah, the divine female, is beautiful, the Lurianic Kabbalah will say the divine female hip bone is connected to the leg bone, is connected to the knee bone. It's more like X-ray vision. So they're very different. And Lurianic Kabbalah is of an order of complexity that goes far beyond anything Kabbalah had seen before. Wait, did I just go backwards? Maybe I did. Okay, doesn't matter. We're anyway really coming close to the end. One of the central figures in Lurianic thought is the primordial Adam, or Adam Kadmon. You could say kind of first personal God in the Lurianic system. And what you're seeing now is an image of the head of the primordial Adam on an ilan, on a Kabbalistic tree roll in the Ritman collection. And it's maybe not so obvious to see it, but the circle is the shape of the head. and the top portion is the mind of primordial Adam. You have some, at least, words indicating eyes, nose, nostrils, mouth, and so forth. We take my word for it, even if you can't see it. This is what it is. And I just wanted to give you a sense. This is not in your collection, but to give you a sense of what a long roll looked like from roughly that same period. This first section has a number of frames that visualize a primordial process known as the divine garment. This is a representation of the very same image that we saw a moment ago from the manuscript in the Amsterdam collection. You can see it's a bit more anthropomorphic. And the Lurianic Kabbalah speaks still about Sfirot, but now more about the divine personalities called the Partsufim, a whole kind of divine family based on a section of the Zohar called the Idrot. And so we went from Adam Kadmon, primordial Adam, to now another figure in this series of divine personalities, this one called Arich Anpin, the very patient one, you could translate it as, now the impatient one, Ze'er Anpin. And then lots of tables, lots of information that need to be transmitted and organized on this roll. Now, another way of visualizing Arich Anpin, that personality known as the long-suffering divine. And now a kind of fractal display of the interconnections between the different divine personalities. And then the use of a sequence of arboreal diagrams to express the important qualities of the three lower worlds taught in the Lurianic system. There are four worlds. Some of you may have heard the term, the four worlds. The realm of the Sfirot and the divine personalities, the Partsufim, is the highest world of Atzilut, but there are also three additional worlds that are populated with different characters. And this literally takes us all the way down to the planetary cosmos with Earth at the center. And this, I just, at the very last minute, wanted to find a picture where I had, you give a sense of scale. So this is from a seminar that I did in Philadelphia at Penn a few years ago. Just give you a sense of what these things look like when they're unrolled. And I want to end now in just the last minute to mention something very important in the Amsterdam connection and the Ritman and your whole world over there that I love so much. Kabbalah Denudata, this Kabbalah exposed, or naked Kabbalah, we might call it today. Written, not really written so much as assembled, compiled, and translated by Christian Knorr von Rosenroth from Sulzbach, Rosenberg. And this is a whole course of Kabbalah. This is everything that an intelligent, Latin, fluent Christian would need to know in order to embark on the study of Kabbalah. It's very well done, very impressive work. And here is an engraving in your copy in Amsterdam of that same head of Adam Kadmon that I showed you a moment ago on the parchment roll. And one of the things that Knorr did was assemble as much material as he could from printed books and manuscripts, including Ilanot, including Kabbalistic trees, including Lurianic trees. And he commissioned a very fine engraver, the man responsible for the frontispiece that you saw a moment ago, to replicate the manuscript Ilanot that he was able to gather, 5 of them, and they all appear on fold-out pages in an appendix to the first volume. I'm just pointing out here by way of not really a conclusion, that Knorr's translations into Latin are faithful. There aren't any Christological interpolations. He also doesn't censor things that might offend Christians when he's translating Kabbalistic texts that can occasionally be obnoxious. Doesn't mean that he didn't presume in a syncretistic manner that Adam Kadmon, primordial Adam, and the Christ were the same thing called by different terms. But when he translates Hebrew Kabbalah into Latin, he doesn't change anything. I think on a broader point, perhaps, that may be nice to think about is that Knorr and his close associates, Leibniz and von Helmont, at least it's been argued that what they were particularly fascinated by in the Kabbalah was their sense that Kabbalah gave so much power to people. They felt that traditional Christianity was disempowering, that people were passive because of this Pauline sense of dependence on divine grace. You couldn't save yourself, but Kabbalah, to their minds, Kabbalah taught that people can not only save themselves, but they had this audacious notion that they could save the divine itself. Oops, I think I didn't mean quite to end the share. I think I have to do one more thank you and a tasteless advertisement for the book. And you can see in the chat that code of 3XGK, capital COZ, that will get you to a site with 30% off for Europeans. If there are any non-Europeans here, let me know. All right, that's it. I'm happy to spend a few minutes with you on questions.
Well, Yossi, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. It was an incredible treat to listen about all your knowledge about the beautiful works that we have and that are beyond outside in the world. I've enjoyed every minute of it, and I've learned so much.
Thank you.
And I would like to kick off our question with a question from one of my colleagues who's eager to ask you.
Hi.
Hello.
And please, meanwhile, feel free to ask your questions in the chat and let us know if you'd like to.
In the Q&A, and then we'll have it. Thank you very much for the lovely lecture. It was such a pleasure. I've been reading your book. I'm halfway through. It was a godsend. I was looking for this because I've been introduced to Kabbalah through my work with the Tarot, mostly Hermetic Kabbalah. And from the beginning, I knew that it's not the thing that I'm looking for. I know there's a lot of cultural appropriation and there are deviations from the path. And as I read through the history of it and I saw that it's coming from a certain type of tradition and lineage, and then your book came and it was answering a lot of my questions, and I still have a lot of questions, but I just want to ask the most important one, which helps me a lot. I've been working on my journey with Kabbalah, especially with the tree and meditating and working with it. And one of the ways that you also talk about in the book is you create your own tree and you work with what you find with the meanings. And the problem that I have is I'm a Sufi myself, and I'm trying to combine Sufi concepts as the Sephiroth, or use the hypostatic aspects of God from the Sufi perspective, to use a tree. My question is, the work that I'm doing, how can it not be cultural appropriation, since I'm not Jewish and I don't speak Hebrew and I'm not part of a Kabbalistic tradition? And I see how the Golden Dawn, for example, or all of these Christian Kabbalists went their path, and I really don't want to do that. What is your suggestion?
That's a great question. And I don't usually say that to people because I'm a sourpuss. But here's my sourpuss answer. You know what? I think that I think the history of humanity and culture is the history of cultural appropriation. I mean, we wouldn't have science if it wasn't for the Arabs having appropriated the Greeks. And I mean, everything I told you tonight too. We Jews appropriated the tree from medieval science. I don't know who this stuff belongs to, and if I did, I don't know if they would care or if it should matter. What I value, of course, is intellectual honesty, intellectual transparency. Sometimes my students say, what makes what makes what you do science? Humanities, right? In fact, where I teach, we say, the human sciences, I suppose, what makes it a science? Maybe it's not the best answer, but I say, anytime I say something, I provide reason and documentation and footnotes, and I say this is what I'm basing what I'm saying on, and you can check. If you think it says something else, then I stand corrected. Now, when you're talking about a more creative project, it seems to me that you can really say whatever you want, but be honest about the sources that you're using. Be transparent about the sources that you're using. You can create an apparatus for for what you produce that lets people appreciate the strands that you've woven together. And when you get to the end of my book, you'll see an example of the work of David Chaim Smith, whose work you may know already. Do you know David Chaim Smith's work?
Yeah.
You do. So, I mean, David's a great guy, and we communicate very frequently. And he sometimes says, "Oh, what the Kabbalists think of me," but I always tell him, what you're doing is great. It doesn't matter if it's pure lineage. First of all, because there isn't such a thing as pure lineage. But one of the things that you also see in my book, I don't know if you got there yet, is that the most frequently reproduced Kabbalistic great tree in the 18th and 19th century opens with diagrams that were taken from Knorr's Kabbalah de Nudata. It's very ironic. But because Knorr was such a decent fellow and didn't interpolate, and he wasn't, okay, if you want to be a Christian Kabbalist, Gesundheit, you just do it. It's fine. But don't pretend it's Jewish Kabbalah. If you want to put a shin in the middle of the Tetragrammaton, that's fine. But don't pass it off as Jewish Kabbalah. But Knorr, even when he wanted to do his own diagrammatic sequence based on a Jewish Kabbalistic primordial sequence, cosmogonic sequence, he was faithful to his texts, and just and he even gives references. This is based on the last chapter of Emek HaMelech, and he tells you exactly where it's from. So, and I guess you get the bottom line is just go for it and be honest about it, like Knorr. Just be honest about what you're doing, and good luck with it. And I hope that it works well for you, and that it advances you in your journey.
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much for the elaborate answer. And we have actually a question from one of our participants. Michelle is asking, are there any contemporary designs or interpretations of the tree that you can recommend?
I know that today online there are lots of people playing around with computer modeling of a kind of 3D tree of life, and I also know that in currently published editions of Kabbalistic classics. There are new computer graphics being added to illustrate concepts all the time. So the visualization of Kabbalistic ideas is something that's still happening and progressing. At the very end of my book, I share a few things that seem to me to be in some kind of continuity, or at least dialogue, with the 600-year-old tradition in Jewish Kabbalah of visualizing the divine realm. But I did not go in any serious way into this whole world of computer modeling and so forth. The one thing that I can say is that my project, in addition to this book, that I would be very happy if people were familiar with, I have a website, ilanot.org. It's now, if you go to that site now, it doesn't yet have our end user interface. It's still just the internal development site, but it's fun to play with, even though it's not even beta yet. We're just designing the user interface now. But what I wanted to say is that in addition to the beautiful high-resolution images of Ilanot that you can already, in some cases, dive into and click and see transcriptions and translations, there's another section of it that you can't see just yet, but you'll be able to see soon, where we've taken the text that was mentioned by the previous questioner, by my host, taken a text that describes in great detail how to create an Ilan. And because that text uses mathematical terminology with great precision, our chief software designer at the Ilanot project has converted the language of that 16th century manuscript into pure code. And as you go through the text, the Ilan is drawn, but it's drawn with pure math rather than, somebody's attempt to render the things that are written and described in words in the manuscript. So it's kind of cool to see an Ilan sort of drawing itself, as it were, online, but that's still a coming attraction and not yet quite available. So keep coming back to ilanot.org and you'll see something.
Well, we are thrilled to see how the website will develop and what will be there in the future to come. And I don't see any questions so far anymore.
I can ask more questions.
I think someone is eager to ask another
I have
question.
a more technical question that is specific about Kabbalah and the tree. I've been looking for the attributions of the letters to the pathways between the Sephiroth, and I have found only two examples that they have it. One is the panoply, yeah, and the other one, the Kirscher.
Which, show me? Did you just try to show me something? I cut you off.
Yeah.
Oh no, there's more than that. In the book, if you look up temerals, Temerles, that's a major site of Kabbalah and palmistry and Sefer Yetzirah coming together.
Hey. But is there different traditions of attributing the letters to the pathways, or is
pathways? Yeah, there are. In fact, I mean, I think that many esotericists tend to presume a kind of a static association between, between, like in this case, the Hebrew letters and the channels that connect the Sfirot. But just as many esotericists presume a kind of idealized tree overall, that it should have a certain form and arrangement, but outside of the realm of such ideals, if you just look in the manuscripts over 600-700 years, one sees that there are just so many different witnesses, and that's true of the array of the Sfirot. It's true of the channels, how many channels, how they are connected, which Sfirot are connected by channels and which aren't. It's conceivable to me that with enough work, and we have actually in the project, in the Ilanot project, done some work on the channels. I'm not sure if anything is already published, but if not, very soon, two of my research colleagues, Eliezer Baumgarten and Uri Safrai, have an article on the channels. And one of the things they've done is establish some families of Kabbalistic trees based on channels like that. And the channels, especially in the classical trees, have sort of distinctive roles to play, some rather surprising roles. It's not a subject that I developed very much in my book. One of the reasons being that I don't think I appreciated sufficiently how significant the channels were, even on the level of establishing families of diagrams. And then after the book came out and talking with my partners on the project, we decided that it was time to kind of take it more seriously. And so that research is being done, but I don't think that there is any one idealized method. But for your purposes, I would say have a look at the temerals anyway. And if the book doesn't give you enough, so be in touch. And there will be temerals material on the website, but if you need it sooner, just be in touch personally.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have more questions.
Sure. We have more questions coming in the chat, and I will combine two questions from Jetze, who is currently reading more about Kabbalah and asking about more introduction into Kabbalah. He just read The Chicken Kabbalah by Duquette and The Mystical Kabbalah by Fortune, and he's looking for more literature. And we have another question by a contributor named Moore, who is himself a Jewish secular and is looking for a more spiritual and Jewish practice-oriented introduction into Kabbalah. So maybe if you have any recommendations on more academic or introductions and and more maybe inward Jewish or spiritual approaches to it, they would both be very happy.
Sure. I think you can look in both cases. You might enjoy looking at some of the books written by Daniel Matt. Daniel Matt is widely known for having produced a wonderful translation and commentary on the Zohar, but he's also written some introductory books on Kabbalah, which are accessible and well done. He also has a book called The Essential Kabbalah, which is an anthology with a little bit of a kind of Jubu orientation. In other words, it's a kind of Kabbalah for people who like Buddhism and who would like to find a Kabbalah that sounds like Buddhism. Adin Steinsaltz, who was one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, wrote a beautiful book called The 13-Petaled Rose, which I think still is worth recommending. And of course, many people enjoy works by Aryeh Kaplan, who was a very interesting Orthodox rabbi who was a pioneer in bringing an appreciation of Kabbalah to the American Orthodox scene in the 1970s and 80s. And he has books like Jewish Meditation, Meditation in the Bible, Meditation in Kabbalah, which I think are also potentially valuable for people. I'm less inclined to recommend his editions of Sefer Yetzirah or the Bahir, but his general books on Jewish meditation, I think, might be good, especially for Moore. I think Moore might like Jewish Meditation, the 13 Petaled Rose, and I always encourage people to also read sources. If you can read the sources, read the sources. Don't read the people telling you what the sources say. So and if you can't read the sources in the original, get a good translation. And that's what Daniel Matt's Zohar is. It's a good translation of the text that you'll want to study if you want to study Kabbalah. Get a friend and good bottle of wine and a copy of the Zohar, and spend a few hours late Thursday night studying Zohar. That's my recommendation.
That
So
sounds
if you're in Amsterdam, you could get something else also if you want, but probably if you're in Amsterdam, you don't care.
No, when you live here too long, you don't care.
Exactly. That's as much
It's
as
the
well as I
same with
know Amsterdam.
politics.
Like,
Yes. If it's in front of your door, it's not interesting anymore.
exactly.
Okay, considering the time is
Yeah.
quite
Well,
late, I would finish off with one last question, and you can give a very short answer, and then we'll finish it up. Does it sound good to you?
let's do it.
All right, so I got a question on how would you recommend how people could learn more about the tree that explored the four worlds, Atzilut,
Well,
etc.
yeah, I mean, my book actually has a lot of information about that. Not, it is a book about the tree and the four worlds to a considerable extent. So, that's a shameless way of ending a lecture, but buy my book and let me know if you have any questions. If you buy the book and you send me
I would not
an
call
email
it shameless.
saying, you
Sorry.
can say, Yossi, I came to your lecture on Zoom and you said to buy your book. I bought it. I read it. Now I have a question. I will answer your email. I promise. Okay.
Great. Okay. So this concludes the Q&A session and our event. And I'd like to thank our speaker, Professor Chajes, and all of you for your great questions. And of course, also the technicians in the back for making this possible. It was amazing. The recording of the talk will be sent out in the coming days. Also be sure to check out the EFM's online universe. Subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and hear about our new events. Our next big thing coming up is on 20th of June. It's a lecture on the incorporation of Egyptian symbolism in Freemasonry, given by Michael Didier. And you can get for this and other things tickets on our website. We hope to see you there and also in our museum as a visitor soon. And so on the behalf of the embassy here in Amsterdam, to all of you where you might be us joining, I wish you a good evening and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much, Yossi. It was incredible. And I think to finish it off with the onion metaphor, we peeled off quite some layers here.
I go brush your teeth. Laila, Gute Nacht.